When my grandfather was younger, he worked for the Soviet police, the militia. He handled his share of unsettling cases, but the strangest one happened in a place called Khrushchev, a long-forgotten factory town in southern Russia. He referred to it as the Prizrak case. Grandpa's face was full of unease, haunted by long-forgotten demons, as he recounted what made the case so special. In the early 50s, the Soviet Union went through a time of heavy industrialization. During these years, many towns similar to Khrushchev were built. The principle was simple. The authorities found a suitable location for factories or other production facilities. Once those were finished, they'd construct cheap living quarters for the workforce. The case started when an older woman arrived at Grandpa's station at Volgograd. Her brother lived in the small town of Khrushchev, but she hadn't heard from him in months. The woman herself was too old to visit the distant town, so she pleaded with the militia to find out if something had happened to him. Khrushchev was hours away from Volgograd, but still fell under their jurisdiction. Grandpa assured her he'd check on him, and set out on the long trip. He told me he'd heard his share of stories about these factory towns, but when he arrived, things were much worse than he'd imagined. The inhabitants of Khrushchev were a sad, malnourished lot, and mostly comprised people who had nowhere left to go. They were either elderly or migrants from distant parts of the Soviet Union. People were scared when he arrived. After he said this, Grandpa was quiet for a moment, and a dark expression showed on his face.
Couldn't blame them. We, the militia, had a terrible reputation. And for good reasons. We did a lot of bad things back then. A lot of bad,
he admitted.
That's just how things were.
His voice trembled, and I saw a flicker of guilt on his face. The inhabitants were worried about what he'd do. Maybe he'd foreclose their homes and drive them away. Maybe they'd be taken to gulags, or worse. Grandpa shook his head.
Bad times. Nothing but bad times.
While he didn't find a hint of the old man, and no one told him anything about him, he learned more about the town of Khrushchev, and how different it was from other similar factory towns. The region it was built in had a history. During the times of the Russian Empire, it was the estate of a noble family. By the time Khrushchev was built, the former Grand Mansion still existed, now vacant and abandoned. Instead of demolishing it, however, the authorities converted it into makeshift living quarters. They unceremoniously divided up the vast, lavish rooms into small one-room apartments, and relocated the future workforce there. After he toughened up on people a bit, though, he learned there was more going on at Khrushchev than merely a man going missing. Over the past 3 years, more than a dozen inhabitants had vanished. A person going missing wasn't that strange, especially during these times. People were poor, rarely had enough to eat, and often ran off to find their luck elsewhere. Hell, sometimes they simply went missing. More than a dozen people vanishing without a trace, though, and informing no one, was a different story. When he informed the local factory overseer, and the higher-ups in Volgograd, an investigation by the militia was started. The authorities weren't concerned about the people, of course.
No,
Grandpa said with a grim expression, and anger on his face.
All they cared for was their damn production quality.
The initial questioning went nowhere. No one was willing to talk or seemed to know a thing. Yet, there was one thing Grandpa heard from time to time. It was a word he only overheard in hushed whispers and quiet murmurs when they thought he wasn't listening. It was the word Prizrak, which is the Russian word for ghost or phantom. When he finally confronted people about it, however, They all pretended they'd never heard about it. It was clear something was going on, and the militia had already made plans for stricter methods of interrogation when someone talked. One day, a factory worker in his late 50s, DeMar, showed up at the militia's makeshift investigation office. He was fidgety, nervous, and didn't even look them in the eye. But he said he needed to talk to them. When they pulled him inside, he sat down, but they all saw how scared the man was, how he was trembling in his seat. At first, he just sat there silently, but finally he opened his mouth, pleading with them not to do anything to him.
I was afraid we'd send him away. Said he had nowhere else to go. Crutchshaw was the only home he had. But someone had to talk. Someone had to say something.
After they'd handed him a stiff drink, the man finally opened up about the noises that haunted the building. He said they'd started years ago, and continued on ever since. At first, everyone thought it was nothing but the old mansion itself, or maybe someone messing with the other inhabitants. God knows, he said, there's no shortage of shady characters in the building. Yet, the longer the noises continued, the more unsettling things became. Those noises, he said anxiously, they were all wrong. At times, they sounded like heavy footsteps. At others, it sounded as if something was scratching or beating against the walls. Sometimes they'd echo from far away, and sometimes they came from right beside you. Occasionally, they'd originate from rooms long vacant and empty. It didn't matter what time of day it was. You could hear them in the early morning, but also in the middle of the night. It was one of the old women who first began talking about the story of the Prizrak. At this point, Grandpa interrupted the man's ramblings and asked him what this Prizrak was. DeMar was quiet again. He cast his eyes down while his feet shuffled over the floor. Grandpa said he had to repeat the question twice more, the third time yelling it at the man until he finally started. DeMar said he was never one to trust in old ghost stories, and told himself it was all humbug, of course. But the longer the noises went on, the more he listened. At first, it was only rumors about a ghost, or a curse someone had put on the old mansion. Before long, however, the rumors developed into a life of their own. There was talk about a serf who'd been murdered by the noble family, while others talked about a disfigured family member who'd been imprisoned in the basement. Some even said it was something much older, a shadow who'd been stalking these old walls for centuries. Grandpa asked him how all of this was related to the disappearances.
Never seen anyone so terrified in my life. I said it was always during these noises. Always when the Prizrak was most active. That someone was taken.
After that, DeMar was almost mumbling to himself. Said it happened all the time now. Daily, ever since the militia arrived. It was only a matter of time now before someone was taken away again. And now that he talked, Grandpa was quick to assure him that nothing would happen to him, and that they would figure out what was going on. After the man left, Grandpa shook his head, and the other members of the militia had a good laugh about the story. None of them were religious, and none of them believed in silly ghost stories, but it seemed the inhabitants thought it to be true. When I asked him how he could be so sure, Grandpa turned to me.
We were all men of the militia, and in all our years, we learned one thing above all else. The darkest and vilest acts are always committed by men themselves. Always.
There was one specific part of DeMar's story, however, that had caught his interest more than anything else. He'd said the noises had happened daily ever since the militia arrived, but none of them had ever heard anything. It seemed as if whatever, or better, whoever was responsible, made sure the militia didn't notice a thing. The plan they hatched that day was simple. They'd bug the place, storm in once the noises started, and catch the perpetrator. For this, they told the inhabitants, they needed to do a sweep of the building to find evidence. In reality, though, they planted a handful of simple listening devices. Nothing sophisticated, but enough to do the trick. Once they were done, all they had to do was wait. The militia men divided into two groups. Grandpa and a few of the others would enter the building, while the rest kept a tight surveillance outside, in case the perpetrator tried to flee the scene. Only a few hours after they'd installed the devices, late in the evening, the noises started again. When Grandpa and the rest entered the building, they found it in pure chaos. People huddled in the hallways. The women were crying and pleading, while some men accused the militia men of angering the Pritzrak. It took them almost an hour to restore order. Once everyone was accounted for, however, one person was missing: DeMar. Grandpa immediately rushed to the man's room, but found it empty. A search was conducted right away. They evicted all the inhabitants and put them under tight surveillance at a nearby factory warehouse. They'd searched through all the rooms, and went through the entire place from top to bottom. Yet even after hours, they found no hint of the man. Some voiced concerns, and a few even wondered if there might be more to the story of the Pritzrak. Then one of them noticed something. He'd been in DeMar's room, rechecking it for what must have been the 5th time. He noticed that a part of the wallpaper looked strange. It was darker than the rest, and hung loosely in front of the brickwork. He thought it was because of the building's terrible conditions, but when he went closer, he noticed it wasn't only the wallpaper, but also the brickwork. The moment he touched it, he noticed he could move it. That's when he called for the rest of the militia men. They quickly removed the loose part of the wall, and found a small entryway leading to the room next door. At least, that's what they thought at first. When one man squeezed through, he noticed that it instead led to a space between the walls. Grandpa left the room to compare the inner and outer dimensions of the room, and realized the wall had to be almost a meter wide. They were puzzled, but after consulting the mansion's blueprints, they discovered this wall was part of the original mansion. Sure, a lot of new walls had been added, but the old ones were still there. When they entered the space, they were even more surprised. It wasn't a hole or a small hideout like they'd originally thought, but a sodden tunnel that led through the entire length of the wall. The air was musty, dirt and fallen plaster was everywhere, and all corners were infested by thick, heavy spider webs. Yet this tunnel was easily half a meter wide, enough space for a human being to pass through. While they explored these narrow tunnels one at a time, squeezing past plaster and bricks, they soon discovered that it led to other, similar tunnels in the original mansion's other walls, all of them with hidden entryways of their own. It was clear what the source of the noises must have been: someone moving through these old tunnels. When checking out the rest of the tunnels, they found even more puzzling things. There was an old, half-rotten mattress stacked between the walls, a chair and a table, and even an improvised cooking area. Before long, they stumbled upon DeMar's corpse. He just lay there, in one of the corners, discarded, his blank eyes staring at nothing, and his mouth still wide open. The cause of death was strangulation, but the man also showed a wound caused by a blunt object. The perpetrator must have entered DeMar's room in the middle of the night, beaten him unconscious before he dragged him into the walls and strangled him. A helpless, futile expression came over Grandpa's face, and he began cursing.
Things like that, they happen a lot. We, the militia, always making promises, always saying we'd protect people, and make sure no harm came to them. But in reality, we rarely did anything. rarely saved anyone.
For a while, he sat there, panting and staring off at nothing, before he continued. Investigating the tunnels, he said, took hours. The men of the militia were hardened, stoic men, yet none of them wanted to venture in on their own, afraid of what they'd find in there. They stumbled upon stacks of old, rotten clothes and various other items, the belongings of all the other people who'd gone missing over the years. They all must have suffered a fate similar to Damar. Yet one thing puzzled them all. Even after searching for hours, no other remains were found. The interrogations went on for an entire week, but even after harsher methods of questioning, the perpetrator was never found. The only thing they knew was that it had to have been one of the building's inhabitants. While there were secret entrances to the wall tunnels all over the building, none of them led outside. After killing Damar, the perpetrator must have left the tunnels and mixed in with the rest of the inhabitants. If they'd had more time, they might have eventually figured out who was responsible. The higher-ups, however, didn't care. It didn't matter to them that a dozen workers and immigrants had died. In the end, the old mansion was demolished. People were relocated to a newer building, and Grandpa and the rest of the militia men left Khrushchev behind. I sat with Grandpa for a while longer, but he'd fallen silent. I was about to get up, thinking the story was over. But when I did, Grandpa sighed heavily. When I looked at him, he had a dark, almost empty expression on his face. His hands were resting on his knees, but I saw him trembling. Finally, he turned to me. His voice nothing more than a whisper.
This case has haunted me for years. But it wasn't because people died. Not because of the promise I made to Damar. No. It was because of something else.
I stared at him expectantly.
There was a routine to these murders. A person was killed every few months.
At first, I didn't know what he was trying to say. But then he reminded me what they'd found inside the walls. And also, what they didn't. I felt sick to my stomach instantly. And when Grandpa saw it, he only nodded. Yes, there was a reason they'd found no remains. And there was a reason for the cooking area.
Terrible times,
Grandpa said, shaking his head.
The country was still in ruins. People were poor. People were starving. But Khrushchev, it was the most impoverished of them all.
Hey everybody, hope you enjoyed today's first of 2 stories. I want to take a quick second to remind you to like, comment, and subscribe on this video. It really helps the channel grow and reach more new people. I was checking recently and saw that around half the people who watch the channel aren't yet subscribed, so I hope you'll take a quick second to hit that button if you haven't yet. Alright, now on to our next story. Matthew awoke to an argument. It was the old couple next door.
Don't have what we need.
Special dish. The back of his head was throbbing, and each word of the barely audible conversation caused a fresh jolt of pain.
Make me go all the way there.
When the front door opened, Matthew opened his eyes. The dim light of the early sun made him squint. The pain in his head persisted, and when he got to his feet, he felt weak and shaky. After a labored, painful breath, tiny, dark spots appeared in front of his eyes. He fell back onto the couch's soft cushions. For long minutes he rested, but breathing was still terribly hard. His throat felt impossibly sore, and the air in his apartment was dry and sticky. Fresh air. He needed fresh air. He stumbled to the window and tore it open. But instead of the fresh air he'd hoped for, the smell of cooking reached him. The neighbors must have had their kitchen window open. He wrinkled his nose at the heavy, spicy aroma. With a curse, he closed the window again. While he wondered what sort of meal they were preparing, he heard the husband returning from the store. He sighed. The building's walls were too thin. He didn't want to, but he couldn't help but listen in as they talked. A fresh argument started, and he heard the old woman pleading again. Her husband grumbled something in answer, and soon Matthew heard his footsteps as he set out on another trip to the store. As he sat there, rubbing his temples, he wondered if something was wrong with his head. He pushed himself up and made his way to the kitchen. He sighed when he saw the perpetual state of chaos. The trash can was overflowing and dirty, and encrusted dishes filled the sink. He wondered when he'd last cleaned, but the pain was still stabbing at his head. His hands were shaking when he picked up a glass and filled it with cold water. Back in the living room, he considered popping an aspirin or two. Aspirin. In the back of his mind, a memory began stirring. One barely out of reach. His thoughts were interrupted when he heard the neighbors again. It was yet another argument. Overcome by curiosity about the weird events next door, he trained his ears. But it won't be my special dish without it. Can't you go to the store and get it?
Make me go all the way there this time of day.
Hadn't he heard that conversation before? He wrinkled his nose as the hint of a strange smell reached him. Was it their cooking? Cursing, he went back to the window and tore it open. The moment he did, the same heavy cooking smell hit him. It was heavier now, more oppressive. The sharp spices and the strong fragrance of juniper stung his nose and made his eyes water. He coughed, waved his hand to drive it away, but the more he fought, the stronger the smell became. He almost gagged, but eventually gave up and threw the window shut. The smell, however, had already spread through his apartment, and it wasn't helping his head at all. For a second, his world began spinning, and he quickly got himself another glass of water. He'd barely emptied it when the neighbors were at it again. The same argument. It raged on before the husband set out once more. By now, he couldn't ignore it anymore. He'd had it with their strange behavior. He threw on a jacket, put on his shoes, and made his way outside. When he stepped into the hallway, he caught a last glance of the old man before the elevator doors closed. Cursing and with quick steps, he hurried down the stairs. Once he'd reached the ground floor, he was panting, but he couldn't see the old man anywhere. Hurrying outside, he saw him across the road, entering the store. Mere moments later, Matthew entered the store and approached him. "Mr. Schuster," he greeted him. The old man's eyes met Matthew's. For a few seconds, he didn't seem to recognize him.
"Oh, the young man from next door. How are you doing?"
Mr. Schuster's speech and mannerisms had a certain edge to it, as if certain gestures and words were too studied. "Not bad," Matthew answered. "How about you, Mr. Schuster? A few last-minute purchases?"
You know how it is. Just getting a few things for the missus. She's cooking her special dish."
Of course. He knew. They'd been talking about nothing else ever since he'd woken up. "Hope you find everything you need," he said out loud instead. Mr. Schuster smiled at him before he continued on his way through the store. As inconspicuous as possible, Matthew trailed the old man. He'd expected Mr. Schuster to get exotic spices, or certain special ingredients he'd forgotten during his earlier trips. Instead, he picked up the most mundane of things. 2 packs of meat, a few carrots, a bundle of celeries, and a selection of herbs. While Mr. Schuster walked to the register to pay for these items and a pack of cigarettes, Matthew got himself a can of Coke.
Must be one hell of a dish they're making,
he joked as he stepped up to the register. The young cashier didn't seem to listen to him. She had spaced out and was staring at nothing. "Hey, excuse me. Do you know how often that old man's been here today?" he asked, louder, and pointed at the leaving Mr. Schuster. Finally, the tired eyes of the young woman met his, almost as if she'd only noticed him now. Then she gave him a shrug. Her mannerisms, too, were slightly off.
"Sorry, my shift just started,"
she answered in a monotonous voice, before she rang up his Coke. After he paid, Matthew hurried back to the apartment building. Mr. Schuster was gone, and the elevator was already going up. When he'd made it upstairs, he saw the old man in front of his door fumbling with his keys. Before long, he unlocked it and shuffled inside, bag of groceries in hand. From afar, he could hear them again. First a mumbled conversation, then another argument. Even out here, he could hear the old woman's agitated words.
"The special dish! The special dish!"
she seemed to hiss. And finally, Mr. Schuster stepped out again and shuffled past him on his way back to the elevator. Matthew watched in stunned silence. By now, the air in the entire hallway was heavy with the oppressive smell of their perpetual cooking. He returned to his apartment and threw the door closed. How long had they been at it? How much were they even making? All he could remember was the first argument that had woken him. If, he realized, it had even been the first. Before that, though, there was nothing. He couldn't seem to remember. His head was clouded, his thoughts hazy. The throbbing was back, and he wondered if it was related to their cooking, to its smell. In an instant, Matthew turned to the hallway and stomped to their door. "Excuse me," he started, and gave the door a knock. When he got no reaction, he knocked again. "Mrs. Schuster, do you have a moment?" When the old woman didn't answer, he grew annoyed, angry, and pounded his fists against the door. As if to answer him, a brownish, soupy liquid leaked from below the door. He stepped back, staring at it in confusion and disgust.
"What the hell?"
he mumbled. There was no end to it. More and more leaked outside, and drenched the carpeted floor of the hallway. Suddenly, the ding of the elevator made him jerk. Out stepped Mr. Schuster, with yet another bag of groceries in his hand. The old man gave him a friendly nod, before he stepped right into the puddle of soup and unlocked the door. When he opened it, more of the brownish soup spilled outward, drenching his shoes and ankles. Mr. Schuster, however, entered the apartment undeterred. Matthew stood there, mouth agape from the surreal sight. The plethora of questions he'd wanted to ask still stuck in his throat. He laughed when he heard yet another argument. What the hell was going on here? When Mr. Schuster left again, more soup surged outside, washing over the floor and splattering against the walls around it. Once more, the old man didn't seem to notice or care, and his wet, squishy steps led him back to the elevator. By now, Matthew didn't just feel anger, wasn't just disgusted or confused. He was afraid. Something was wrong here. Very wrong. He fled to his apartment, but found the air heavy with the same oppressive smell that wafted through the hallway. The walls in his living room looked different. He reached out his hand and found the wallpaper wet and sticky. When he pulled it back, his hand was covered in grease. As he stared at it in disgust, the argument next door played out yet again. The old couple's voices were more animated and strangely over-exaggerated now. When Mr. Schuster eventually opened the door, more soup spilled outside, washing through the entire hallway. Matthew threw himself on the couch and pushed his hands against his ears to drown out the sounds outside. None of this made any sense. It couldn't be real. It had to be a dream or a mental episode, a hallucination. After only 10 minutes, they were at it again. He lay on his couch, curled into a ball, and listened to the ever-repeating argument. Each time, their voices became more agitated, more distorted, and more inhuman. Suddenly, the strangest of feelings washed over him. It wasn't so much acceptance. It was indifference. If none of this was real, then... More than an hour had passed when Matthew left his apartment again. He gave no heed to the soup that flooded the hallway, or the sudden derelict state of the walls. Next door, Mr. Schuster, or what had once been Mr. Schuster, pushed itself from the door. His body had changed, warped itself into a bloated, blob-like creature. Matthew's eyes grew wide, and a cry escaped his mouth. He cringed back. But to his surprise, the creature didn't pay him any notice. Instead, it shambled through the flooded, derelict hallway and entered the rusty cage, which had now replaced the once pristine elevator. In a feverish trance, and strangely fascinated by the changes, he made his way through the liquid, distorted hell of the hallway. When he entered the staircase, he saw it had turned into a twisting spiral of creaking, worm-eaten wood. The world outside had changed too. The road had become an upheaved crater landscape, and the buildings had contorted into grown-together monstrosities of brick and mortar. He stood, staring in wondrous horror at the waking nightmare that played out around him, before he followed the shambling, bloated thing. What was once a normal grocery store entrance was now a gaping, looming maw, leading underground. The inside was a labyrinthian mess of twisted, rotted shelves, with the most nightmarish goods. Meat twitched and squeaked inside its packaging. Vegetables had become caricatures of themselves, and everything else had warped itself into creations that defied explanation. The young cashier had changed into an elongated, impossibly thin version of herself. Her head was gigantic, and reached high above the highest of shelves, her bulging eyes following his every step as he traversed the once store. Matthew watched in horror as one of the squirming pieces of meat crawled from its packaging and closed around his hand. When he felt the wet, sinewy flesh, its gentle, almost caressing touch, the trance he'd been under was shattered. Gone were the feelings of wonder and curiosity, of acceptance and indifference. If he could feel it, didn't it mean it was no hallucination? No dream? All of this had to be... real. Fear washed over him in hot waves, before terror gripped his soul. In an instant, he fled from the nightmarish and distorted reality back to the apartment building. After he'd ascended the winding spiral staircase, he found the hallway a raging torrent of gooey soup. He had to fight himself forward as the sticky, knee-high liquid washed against his legs. He noticed things drifting past him, staring at him from half-hidden eyes, and reaching for him from half-formed appendages. Screaming, he tore them off of himself, pushed open the door to his apartment, and threw himself inside. For long minutes, he was nothing but a shaking, quivering mess. Why had the world become like this? The phone. Where was his phone? He had to call someone. Anyone. Had to tell them. He stopped. The phone. He remembered something about his phone. "Never call me again, you creep! Leave me alone!" The words reverberated inside his head, mocking him. A call. No. A voice message. Emotions came flooding over him. Embarrassment, sadness, and finally, despair. Matthew felt tears coming to his eyes without knowing why. Next door, the neighbors were screaming at each other. Their voices had become distorted and animalistic, barely resembling those of humans. And yet, he still heard it. Still heard the she-beast next door growling about her goddamn special dish. "No one cares about your special dish," he screamed at the greasy living room wall. He stepped forward to pound his fists against it, to make his rage heard. But instead of hitting a solid surface, his fist sank into the greasy mess that had replaced it. He cringed back while the animalistic argument next door continued undeterred. "Be quiet! Shut up!" he screamed at them. Then, other memories flooded his mind. Other voices. The voices of former friends and acquaintances. Of family. "Be quiet. Get lost. Drop dead." Dead? "Oh God, no," he mumbled when he remembered what he'd done. His anger dissipated and was replaced by apathy. He slumped down on the couch. Finally, Matthew remembered. The special dish. While he'd overheard his neighbors talking about it, he'd prepared one of his very own. The aspirin, he remembered. No. Not just the aspirin. Any medication he could find. He downed it all in his very own special dish. To end his miserable life. But then, what was this world? Was it hell? His very own private hell? What if he was dying right now, and a last surge of brain activity replayed his final conscious moments repeatedly? Maybe this world was nothing but a cruel, never-ending mockery of Zeno's paradox. He sat in his hellish apartment. An apartment filled with heavy, greasy air that made his lungs hurt, and his head throb. An apartment that was slowly being flooded by the disgusting brownish soup, and the horrors that populated it. If this was caused by his brain shutting down, his own memories deteriorating, would each iteration of this hellscape become worse? And as he sat there, Matthew hoped, no, prayed, for only a single thing. That this endless loop would be over, and the neighbors would finally finish their special dish. Become a channel member today for early access, bonus videos, and special emojis only available to members. Check out the description below or click the join button for more info. If you'd like another way to help support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/Jordan Group Horror. As a patron, you'll get access to bonus videos and content. You'll be credited at the end of every video going forward, and if you decide to stay for 3 months, I'll name a character after you which will be featured in a Hollow's End story. Links to join the Patreon are in the description. Thanks everyone for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment to help the channel continue to grow, and see you again next time at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope you have a great night.